The Public Safety Committee is now called to order. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Yes. Alderman Boyd.
Present.
Alderman Vaccaro. Present. Alderman Cone. Alderman Arnowitz. Alderwoman Hubbard. Alderman Kotar. Alderwoman Spencer.
Present.
Alderman Muhammad. Alderwoman Boyd.
Present.
Chairman Kennedy.
Here.
5 present.
Thank you. We have 2 items on the agenda today. First, we have very pleased to have Ms. Trisha Gordon from the United Way, who was unable to get to us at our last meeting. She was out ill. I invited her today. She did not tell me that she was still not totally back yet. So I feel terrible that we have forced her to come to the meeting today. But that we're also very pleased that she's taken the time out. As you know, the United Way looks at the Prop S proposals and then scores them and sends it back over to us upon request of this Board of Aldermen. They're doing it without any fee. They're doing it out of their interest and concern for the community. Ms. Gordon leads that up for that effort, and we've asked her to come today so they can talk to us a little bit about their scoring process. They should be finishing up very shortly and getting that back to us.
Yeah, tomorrow.
Now, she has just gotten her voice back. So if we have some questions, we may have to do our best not to strain her voice here today. But we do very much appreciate your coming out and talking with us today.
No problem. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. And I do apologize for not being here last week. I was sick, but I have not missed a day of work. I did tell Alderman Kennedy that when I talk for an extended period of time, I can go into a coughing fit. So if you hear me pause, it's just me catching my breath. So apologize for that in advance.
Yes.
That will help. Sometimes it doesn't, but yes.
Okay. We're going to get you some water.
Yeah. So you have a folder in front of you, and I'm going to go through the items. But before I go through the items, the purpose of me being here today is to pretty much talk about our process at United Way for reviewing the Prop S proposals. And again, we're very thankful that the committee via Alderman Kennedy has reached out to us every year. So I think this is our 5th year, maybe going into our 6th years for us, providing this service to review the proposals, of course, free of charge. Our focus is to make sure that we're able to kind of help assess agencies and review the proposals and just kind of give our feedback around the agency's potential to provide the service and be good stewards of the tax dollars. So I'm going to just give you guys a brief overview of our general process for how we recruit volunteers to be a part of this review process and kind of walk you through the continuum of the reviewers from beginning to end. And then I'll direct your attention to the documents in the folder throughout the presentation. But feel free to stop and interject if you have questions, because a lot of times that's where the most information is able to be shared, when I'm able to address the questions that you may have versus for me waiting to the end. So for the most part, we wait on the call. We kind of anticipate the call from the committee for the opportunity. We've gotten used to doing this process over the years, so we kind of start talking about it in August with our team, so to kind of give them a heads up that, you know, we may potentially get that call in late October to do this process. So we're pretty much geared up and ready to go by the time we get that email. But to be fair to the process, we do send out a request starting from senior leadership on down for reviewers to take part of this process. And we've averaged roughly about 15 to 20 reviewers each year, and averaging about 4 to 5 proposals per reviewer. And we put 2 reviewers on each proposal in addition to my oversight, and I have been involved in this process, thank you, since we've started reviewing. Let me step back and say one of the things that we really try to focus on is making sure that the reviewers are diverse, even within our organization. We have about 150 plus staff on board, but we don't go outside of our United Way family to recruit volunteers because it's such a short turnaround time. And then it gives our diverse group within United Way an opportunity to take a look at an external grants review process and kind of give their objective view. So we look for senior leaders on down, from senior VPs on down to folks in services, 211 managers, all levels of profession to be a part of this process. And we actually make it a requirement that we have at least 2 individuals across our entire division throughout United Way, just so we have that broad perspective. And I go through all of the agencies. I will say that, when we first started doing this process, we averaged about 25 to 26 proposals. We're up to almost 60. So the process is growing for us, and therefore we need more reviewers. More reviewers, the less apps they have to review. So I'll just put that out there. But we want to make sure that the reviewers are diverse and they represent a wide spectrum of the individuals that are submitting their proposals. And we know that they're serving a diverse community. We know the agencies are diverse, so we want to make sure that the individuals that are reviewing the proposals kind of come from all different walks of life. So we don't necessarily put a criteria on their expertise and their background. So I just want to put that out there. So a part of the process is I bring the reviewers together, and we actually do an informal training where we actually talk about what the steps are. And I'll direct your attention to the actual scoring rubric that you have in your folder. This is the #1 training tool for us that we use. It's Excel-based, and it's a little bit more extensive. This is a summary version of the tool, but basically the reviewers come together. We actually go through about an hour and a half of training where we talk about walking through what's expected of them to actually review the proposals. I go through all of the proposals, literally like a fine-tooth comb, and I give them a grade from literally A to D that has nothing to do with schooling, but it's a classification on the size of the agency, their experience within a community, my interpretation of their ability to provide the service and be good stewards of the dollars, and that ensures that all the reviewers get a wide gamut of the proposal. So if we have 60 proposals and 20% fall within the A category, 20% fall within the B category, and vice versa, I ensure that each reviewer has at least 2 A's, 2 B's, 2 C's, 2 D's to make it fair to the process, because in the end, I'm consolidating everyone's data into one. So again, after we train on this tool, literally Excel-based, we kind of walk through, make sure there's questions that need to be addressed, and then they are issued their set of proposals, and we pair them up. So ideally, it's transparent. They can see all the reviewers that are on the list, and they can see which proposals have been assigned. So if I gave, Alderman Spencer A through F, she can actually see that Trisha's been assigned A through F, and that gives them an opportunity to interact. If they want to call each other, meet, that's optional, but again, they have someone else outside of me who's actually looking at those proposals. So again, they get a quick turnaround, roughly a week and a half. Normally, we do this over our extended Thanksgiving break by the time we get the proposals, and so these are folks that know that that's a requirement. Otherwise, they're trying to crunch it in before they leave, but a lot of them that have done this for us over the years look forward to that opportunity. To kind of, take a break off for Thanksgiving and review proposals. Then we come back together. Once the proposals have been submitted to me, we come back together and we debrief and we talk about the process. We do this throughout United Way for all of our processes as a way to improve the services that we're providing and just to get better as staff. So again, we go through this process. We hear some of the same things over and over again, but we're able to talk about the proposal itself, ways we could have made it better. They ask questions around whether the individuals and organizations submitting the proposals have received education. Did they get an informational? Did they get insight on how to complete the proposal? Is there technical assistance provided? So we kind of go through that and logistically just talk about, our objective is to review the content of the proposal. It's supposed to be a standalone item. But again, we go through what are some ways that the city could ideally make this process better for anyone that's applying for grant funding with the city or any other funder that may potentially be of interest to them. And so we go through that debriefing, which is really important. And so we talk about what they found as far as nuances, lessons learned, challenges they had with going through the review, and then we just kind of leave it at that. I, in return, take all of the information, so averaging about 2 individuals per proposal, so that's literally about 100 plus, up to about 140 reviewers that I'm literally going through their reviews and just kind of making sure they didn't miss anything. If there's questions, if there's follow-up, that's going on throughout the process. But again, once I get all of the information, there is time for me to synthesize that and kind of give my overall perspective and just kind of make sure that all of the information is consolidated accurately, in addition to and high-level overview that I give. So I've talked about the scoring rubric that the reviewers use. Are there any questions at this point? Okay.
Doesn't appear to be. Thank you.
All right. So the next item I just want to share, just so you guys know, before I put the actual proposal in the reviewer's hand, there's another sheet in your folder, and it's titled Scoring Rubric One, and it just looks a little different. It's not 2 pages for one, it's one, and there's a reference at the top that says max 44. Pay no attention to the number, but what I do with this tool is, this is my master scoring tool, and for me, I look at what the requirements are for the city, and some of these things that folks that are submitting their applications may take for granted. It's really important when you have close to 4 or 5 dozen proposals that people follow instructions, that they give the city what they've asked for, versus organizations who do go rogue. They don't follow the instructions. They do what they want to do because it's easier for them. We understand that, but when you're reviewing 60-plus proposals, you want to be really conscious of the folks that took time to follow the instructions, because it makes our job easier and they follow the format. So what I do is I take this high-level Excel sheet and I go through and I look for some of those simple things. Did they put the entire document in one page? Did they, submit their 990? Did they go through and actually do their insurance? And some of those things take some high level of attention that I have to give to. But for you, I just want you to know that that's a high level overview, that I don't put that on the reviewers. It's almost like looking at this saying, if they have not even met half of these, why give the proposal to the reviewer to even take that extended amount of time if they didn't even meet the basis? But we've learned that from the city, you guys still want to be able to make those decisions, and these are some things that we can potentially work around based on the different levels of nonprofits that are submitting their proposals. We understand that there are mom and pops that are doing great work, and they're not going to compete with a Big Brothers Big Sisters or Girl Scouts that has hundreds and hundreds of years of experience. So we understand that the city uses this as a criteria, so we don't spend a lot of time putting this in front of the reviewers, but I want you guys to know when you're reviewing it that, hey, they didn't follow the instructions, they didn't submit everything that you asked, and I give them a scoring on that as a level before even the review is done. So that's really how you would use this document. Any questions about the high-level overview?
I just want to be clear.
Sure.
So, even though they didn't really meet the requirements like we were at, you still send it to a reviewer?
I still go ahead and send it to the reviewer. One of the initial things when we first started reviewing for the city, we were really, really tough on some of these proposals, because that's what we do at United Way. And so we had to really step back and look at the caliber of agencies, first of all, that the city was targeting with these dollars and the ultimate impact that you were trying to make. And so when we think of some of the mom and pops, those are the first ones that come to mind, because those are the ones that have a tendency to be struggling. What's the intended use of the funds? How much support are we really going to give this organization, and what's the ultimate goal? So we don't want to make that decision for you, but we understand when you have the agencies in front of you, that's a criteria that we will put on you to make. And I think we've had discussion with some staff members before that it was pretty much out of our purview to really make that decision. If we give the information to you and you're reviewing an agency and you want to know why they scored low, this would just help you guys better make your decision.
Out of curiosity, have you found that some of the applications, they didn't pay attention to detail, which was the requirement, however they scored well based on their programmatic?
Say that one more
proposal?
time.
Have you found that even though they missed the mark on providing all the necessary documentation, have you found that they still scored well based on the programmatic?
Yeah, and that's a case by case. That's exactly true, because we have some that didn't meet some of these formalities, but they still have a solid, strong program, and we see that. And so that's another reason why we step back, because if you limit them to this and don't even get a chance to review the great work or the potential, you miss out. So again, that's why we put it in front of you for you guys to make that decision.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions about this?
No.
Okay. So the last thing I shared is, so when we think about wrapping up the process, coming along. When we think about wrapping up the process, a part of my job, like I said, is to consolidate all of the information. And so what you have is a snippet of what I do, kind of like what I call my master summary report. So first and foremost, I return every scoring rubric. So it's a massive spreadsheet that has every reviewer's score. So literally you have the agency and you have the two reviewers and you have their side-by-side scores, and then I consolidate that. I also do the same thing for the high-level overview that I provide. And then what I do is I synthesize it into a master report. And so since we've been doing this for a number of years for the city, I'm really big on data and looking at historical trends. And so what I try to accomplish with this document, and it's double-sided, but again, it's Excel-based, is to take a look at, first and foremost, how the agency's fared. So the green gives you an idea of, based on the scores, the reviewer scores, and as well as my input, who kind of made it to the top of the tier. And these are just our suggestions all the way to the end to the ones that scored very low, and they're kind of highlighted as red. So you go green, yellow, red. And it ideally lists the agency, both reviewer scores, the average score across them, and then the program requirements. Those are my high-level requirements. And you kind of see how they scored. And then I look at historical funding. So one of the things I talked to Alderman Kennedy about is, what is the intent as far as how long you will choose to fund an agency? So some of these agencies, we've been seeing, they've been receiving funding literally since the inception, and it's been really amazing to see these agencies' growth, because when they first came in and submitted their proposal, the proposals were not as strong, but they still provided a great service. And as a result of receiving city funding continuously, they got so much better with their proposals and their applications. And so for someone that's been reviewing for 5 years, you can see that growth, and it's reflective. But again, is the intent to give funding 5, 6, 10 years? When do you say, okay, is this program sustainable? When does the city say, you know, we're going to step back and give another organization an opportunity to provide services, or are they the only game in town? So for me, I just share this to really just give insight around how long the agency has received the funding from the city, what's been the overall investment over that 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and just something for you to be aware of as far as how much you all have kind of invested in that agency overall. Because if they receive funding for 4 or 5 years, that means that they must be doing something good, and the committee really values the work and are making a significant impact within our community. So who can judge that? So that's the purpose of this document, and there are some other items that are included in this that kind of gives the thinking around coming up with this. I think some of the questions we asked, or that the city asked on the cover letter, is how many years have you received funding? And so we do kind of look at that too, again, just for knowledge purposes. So any questions?
Alderman Boyd?
I'm trying to respect the fact that you're trying to be healthy, but I just have to know this.
That I'm trying to be healthy?
Yeah, your voice. I'm
Oh,
trying to
yeah,
save your
yeah.
voice.
Oh, that's okay.
But it says maximum score of 75. Mm-hmm. But there's some people who have a score higher than 75.
Which document are you looking at?
This one you just talked about.
Okay.
For example, the Wyman has 77, MERS Goodwill has 76, St. John Community Corporation has 76, and which throws the average score.
Right. And so this was probably a sample. I'm pretty sure that score probably was changed. We kind of varied that score over the years, because what I do is I take the proposals, and so this is just an error. You know, it's been updated. What I try to do is look at the proposal, and if it's 7 sections, for instance, I kind of arbitrarily assign numbers. So, you know, 4 or 5, just try to make it roll up. And so this year I got it to a solid 100. So it's a clean-cut number, but it's really hard to add value when some questions are simply a yes or no that they have this versus confidence. So let me step back. When we are giving the reviewers the opportunity to go through this, this is just their expertise. They're not experts in grants. They're not experts in these organizations, but these are supposed to be standalone proposals. So we're asking them to give their confidence rating on, after you review this, how confident are you that this organization could pull this off? How confident that you are that this agency demonstrated in the application the historical content of their program? How confident? So that's the key word. So with this, the numbers have varied. And so with some of the scoring rubrics, some individuals give a higher number. If I say the max number is 5, they want to give them a 10. So those are just variations. So what I've done over the years is lock the fields, lessons learned, lock the fields, kind of ensure that reviewers are restricted to the scoring parameters, and those are just lesson learned. Because when we first started doing this process, we received CD-ROMs. We had to really consolidate. So again, it may take us a week to really synthesize the information received from the city. It's not electronic based. We've moved there as of last year. I convinced them to go to Google Docs. But before that, we would have a box of jump drives, and we would literally have to download everything. And it would take us weeks on the front end to do that when we're so used to at United Way being electronic based, where everything rolls up into one document and it's easy to pull out the reports. So being able to go through and kind of manipulate each question and give it a value, that's me just doing that arbitrarily. So the scores may be a little bit off, but the final scores that I submit to the committee are accurate. This is just an example that we started using years ago.
And explain again what the proposal requirement, explain that column again in that scoring.
Proposal requirements?
Yes, what's that?
So at the beginning of the proposal, it's about a 7 or 8 page document that organizations receive as far as the requirements. And so before they even start writing the proposal, it asks them simple questions is, are you actually a registered business? I'm just using it as an example. Have you got your license with the city? Do you have a 990 on file? Have you filed a recent 990? Do you have insurance for your business? And so one of the things that I do is, there's no due diligence on the front end from the city. No one provides a service that says, we've checked all of these items for you before we send a proposal. So I get everything just as is. So I take time and go through, and I look at their city license. Sometimes I have to make phone calls to the city, and sometimes I have to log into the IRS website, and that's extra, but sometimes the materials that they're providing, just based on what we do at United Way, I know it's not accurate. I know it's not a valid 990. It's just an application. So some of those things is really what I'm doing to come up with this proposal requirement. So I try to keep it really clean and not be too critical of their submissions, because again, there may be flexibility with the city to say, we're okay if they're at the application stage. We're okay if it's pending. We will follow up with that, I'm assuming. So I try to say yes, no, yes, no.
Okay, thank you.
They do.
Were there any other questions of the committee? Your presentation was very thorough and very informative.
You.
You hanging on?
I did good.
Okay, you did
good.
excellent. You did excellent. I didn't realize you were still in this condition,
It's
or we would have
okay, that's
rescheduled
okay.
you.
I'm not contagious.
Believe me, I did not know she was still a little ill till she walked
Okay.
in here today, so
That's okay.
don't blame me. Possibly when the subcommittee starts meeting, we may need your help.
If you can get me those dates, I was just talking to Alderman Spencer about that, so I miss it every year just because the date comes a little bit late in the holidays. So if I have it, just let me know and I could definitely be
We'll do
here.
so.
That's where I'm seen and not heard, right? Just sit back and
Well,
listen.
we may have some questions. Certainly, your expertise on what you have done and the information you're providing would be of great benefit to the subcommittee.
Yeah, well, it'll be a benefit for us too, because that's the closure piece that we've never been able to get at United Way, as far as coming in to see exactly how you use this information and just how we could be more valuable in the future. So maybe just listening to some of your discussions, it could really inform how we modify some of these reports and make them simpler, as far as you guys being able to really make more clean decisions. We use this as a process that works for us, but just because we submit it to you, even though it's a free service, no charge, we still want to make sure that we're giving you guys the right end documents to make your decision. So if it's too much, if it's not enough, I would really like to be able to hear that on the back end so we can improve our process for this.
All right, thank you very much.
right,
Really
thank you.
appreciate all your work on behalf of this process.
Okay, thank you, guys.
Thank you. Next, we will call up Nicole Hudson. They have a presentation for us, as you see, on the PowerPoint governing from an equity lens.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for having us. It will be myself, and I'll be tag teaming with Cristina Garmendia here and Patrick Brown right here. Awesome. So the point of this presentation is to give update on how the mayor's office has been approaching racial equity as the administration has gotten up and running. So the overview of this presentation will give a little bit of background. We will talk about the administration's philosophy and approach to racial equity, the intersection with public safety, as this is the Public Safety Committee, and some specific initiatives that we are involved in to start this work. So I wanted to start with kind of a timeline so that we can all see that this is something city government has been working on over time. This is not new.
Pardon me.
Oh,
You
we're going
did
to
have
pass
the
out.
copy that's sitting right here. Do take it.
Great. Start with a timeline here to show that this is an ongoing effort. This was started before this administration. Board of Aldermen has been involved in this. And just briefly looking at, since the Ferguson Commission report came out in 2015, the Board of Aldermen passed a resolution to have hearings on racial equity and how that intersected with government. On August 1st, Patrick Brown here was named as Chief Resiliency Officer through our participation in Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities program, and he'll talk more about how racial equity is a core piece of his work. In August 19th of 2016, some city leadership, mayor's cabinet went through a day-long training with Khatib Wahid on institutional and systemic racism. In October of 2016, the Government Alliance for Race and Equity offered a half-day training for the Board of Aldermen and city leadership. In April of 2017, Mayor Cruson and some of our key staff went through an intensive 2.5-day workshop on institutional racism and systemic racism. May 1st, I was sworn in as the Deputy Mayor for Racial Equity and Priority Initiatives. And in May of 2017, we were awarded a grant through the Resilient Cities program from the Rockefeller Foundation to do an equity indicators project, which will help measure our progress on equity, which Christina will talk about. And then in November of this year, Christina started with us to work on that project. So the administration's philosophy on racial equity is that this is an institutional systemic effort. And I want to define racial equity in the way that we look at it. Equity, or racial equity, is a future state in which outcomes can no longer be determined by race. So when we talk about equity, it's not the same as equality, giving everybody the same. When we talk about equity, it's giving people what they need to compete equally. So I think I've heard President Reed used the example of, if you give everybody a loaf of bread, if somebody hasn't eaten in a week, that's different from somebody who just had a full meal. So this idea of equity is really filling that space and seeking an outcome in the future where a baby is born anywhere in St. Louis, and by its zip code, you might not be able to predict its life expectancy. So this is systemic work. This is work that needs infrastructure. This is work that isn't a project, but is something that we seek to become part of how we do our job. It's quickly becoming nationally practiced that a government, especially in urban cities, that is doing well, understands and implements equity in their work. We see it as a growth strategy, demographic changes in the world, in the country, but here in St. Louis we know that half of our population roughly is African American, and we have gross disparities. So in order to succeed and grow as a city, which we know is critical, we have to address equity. Also as a performance metric, and that's where we get to the Equity Indicators Project, we need to be clear about how our work is furthering equity. And then also as a commitment to our citizens. We know well the disparities that we have in service delivery and other spaces of our government operations, and we need to be able to promise to our citizens that we are governing equitably. And so the first thing you have to do, if you're really serious about this, is have somebody whose job it is to look at this stuff. And so we have myself, our Chief Resiliency Officer, Patrick, and Christina here. Patrick, as some of you know, has been in city government for about 8 years, formerly Chief of Staff, formerly liaison to the Board of Aldermen, and Christina was here in St. Louis for about 6 years, and we just drew her back, and she is a data policy equity expert that we were very happy to come have join us here. And so how does this intersect with public safety? I think we kind of get that, but I'll be specific and intentional, which is one of the principles of addressing equity. We know we have disparate access to services, as I mentioned, and we know things like vacancy, things like response time, things like people being comfortable coming to your neighborhood to give you services. All of those things are tied into public safety. Social cohesion, we know that we have a severe lack of trust between our law enforcement, public safety, and generally government and some of our citizens, disproportionately our African-American citizens. So we know that addressing equity, we know that we get the government, we get the law enforcement that reflects our community. So having that addressing those social issues as a community is critical for achieving equity. We know that crimes don't get reported. People take things into their own hands because of this mistrust, that we are unable to close cases and solve crimes because of this mistrust. You know, these are critical issues as we seek to address our crime issues. And then, of course, we know that poverty is a driver of crime. The father of crime, as some would say, and economic mobility. I think St. Louis is ranked 43 for economic mobility out of the 50 largest cities, and that being the likelihood that from one generation to the next you'll move up the economic ladder. We have an unemployment rate by race that is multiple times that of whites. So these are all issues that tie directly into public safety. So the initiatives that we have 3 specific initiatives that are supporting this effort. The first is building capacity around our ability to understand, have a common language, and weave racial equity into our work. The second of which is having racial equity as a core piece of the Resilient Cities strategy, which again Patrick will talk more about, and then the Equity Indicators project that Christina will talk about. So I'll start with the racial equity capacity building. So we have some existing capacity. The Mayor's Cabinet and the Board of Aldermen, as I mentioned, went through trainings in 2016. The mayor and about 10 of the staff in our office have gone through a 2.5-day intensive workshop that focuses on institutional intervention and continuance of systemic racism. There are about 600 plus stakeholders, nonprofit leaders, for-profit leaders who've been through this 2.5 intensive day program. So having the mayor's office and soon to be cabinet and leadership in the city go through the same program is a key part of that building social cohesion part. And then the Bloomberg Cities Challenge, the application that we put in from the mayor's office for that is focused around investing in the social and emotional heavy lifting that is needed to start to rebuild that trust between community and law enforcement. So those are things that are underway. To expand that capacity, as I mentioned, the mayor's cabinet and department leadership will be going through that 2.5-day intensive. It really builds off of the trainings from last year, and we'll be looking at what trainings follow that up and workshops and how we continue to keep that learning and technical assistance going. The Bloomberg Cities Challenge, we'll find out in January whether we made it to the next round, but both Jimmy Edwards and the mayor have given the nod that even if we don't make it to the next round, we can start to look for ways to resource moving forward on that anyway. And then the Equity Indicators project in Resilient Cities, which I will now pass it over to Patrick to talk about.
Do we want to pause?
Yeah.
We just said a whole lot of stuff before we say a bunch more stuff. I don't know if we want to pause for a understanding check or any questions at this point.
No questions at this point.
Okay.
We're ready for more stuff.
Give us your stuff.
I'll give you all the stuff. So Patrick Brown, Chief Resilience Officer in the Mayor's Office. Thanks for having us. So 100 Resilient Cities, the partnership with 100 Resilient Cities and the City of St. Louis, formerly known as Resilient St. Louis, was a project initiated after the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson. We submitted an application to the Rockefeller Foundation, and generally speaking, this is a global initiative of 100 cities all over the world, where the Rockefeller Foundation pays for staff capacity within city government, within the mayor's office, to help the city itself write a resilience strategy, which is basically everything. And so it's a challenge, and it's unique depending upon the city that you're in. Our challenge is less shock of earthquake, less the impacts of heat wave, though those things are all real. But really, and as you all know, it's more of the stressor side of the house, which is our infrastructure, our racial issues, our financial situation, our government operations, our antiquated policies, our governmental structure, our fragmentation, all the fun stuff. Those are really our resilience challenges as it relates to a city and a region, and so that's primarily the type of thing that our strategy will focus on. My job principally is to do two things: write a strategy and then work with the city on an implementation strategy to do those things. And while we're drafting that strategy, my work is to liaison between us and the Rockefeller Foundation. So when we decide that we have X challenge, they provide X resource to help us solve that in some degree. It'd be great if they just decided to write a bunch of checks to us so we could solve all these challenges, but that's not how they've done this. But they do have a cohort of partners that they've organized, and there's about 100 or so partners, and it's always growing, of organizations like the Urban Land Institute, Microsoft, a number of other partners, to help cities think through and address whatever the challenges are that they provide in their strategies. So a couple of project milestones. My first deliverable is what's called a preliminary resilience assessment, which is kind of the first report of 2 reports that I have to produce. That project will be completed. It's done now, but it's with a designer. This will be a well-crafted, beautifully designed sort of document to help explain what it is that we've been doing from the time that I was appointed till now, and give some next steps for the phase 2 and 3 of our work. The resilience strategy we're planning, as long as everything goes well, as I found out from the first document, it takes a lot longer to do these things than you ever expect, but we're aiming for spring 2018 for the publishing of that actual document. How this relates to equity. Again, I mentioned that we applied for this grant to the foundation in August of 2014. Principally because the way that we understood a shock to our resilience at that time was the social unrest and the rioting that was taking place in the region, and it really caught us off guard. We hadn't seen anything like this for a very long time, and I think largely we understood that we were ill-prepared to deal with it on a regional scale. And so we applied, and we listed our number 1 shock to resilience as riot and civil unrest, which I think is now, retrospectively, a kind of simple deduction of what that actual challenge was, when the real challenge was all the things that Nicole mentioned, and that is the systemic racism, the endemic poverty, all those things that lead to what we saw in the streets and what we continue to see in the streets. And so my job, I knew, was to propose some ideas to not just, bigger barricades, larger batons, more tear gas. That's like the stereotypical reaction to riot and civil unrest. That's not what we need. We need more of the other sort of systemic solutions that Nicole had mentioned previously. And so this is not a unique situation for us necessarily. Almost every American city within the Rockefeller program, which there are 24 other U.S. cities, identified equity and race as a significant challenge for them. And so they offered a second wave of funding that we applied for 2 weeks after Mayor Cruzen took office. We submitted an application for the Equity Indicators Project. And that funding allowed us to hire Christina and to allow us to take on this kind of bold initiative to begin tracking and publicly acknowledging the types of systemic equity challenges that we have in the city. And then another component of this is that, economic development is a polarizing conversation in the city of St. Louis, especially as recently various lawsuits, various challenges to sorts of projects that are going on. And what it really just draws out for us is that, again, as Nicole mentioned, there's a distrust of how we do things, and a misunderstanding and perhaps an antiquated way of analysis and evaluation. And so we can utilize this opportunity with the Rockefeller Foundation to leverage those partners to come in and help us facilitate a more productive conversation about what equitable economic development would look like. And so in February, we're proposing a 2-day workshop on the topic called a collab, which is really bringing in a lot of those partners to help us look at our economic development ecosystem, the policies, the procedures, the incentives, and perhaps specific neighborhoods and projects, so we can begin, I think, a more productive conversation on what the future of economic development looks like in the city of St. Louis, so we can make sure that when we do these types of projects, they benefit more than just the project, more than just the community that the project's taking place, and more than just those developers.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having us. Again, my name is Cristina Garmendia. I'm the Equity Indicators Project Manager, and so I wanted to give you an update and an overview, a preview, and to give you a sense of how I'm going about choosing. We're in the phase where we're choosing the equity indicators, how I'm going about doing that. So one thing is we've been following up with all the work that's been done before. So one of the first things we did in early November, last week of October, was begin holding stakeholder meetings with people who had been involved with the Forward Through Ferguson report, and some of you were in attendance at those meetings. We've had 5 of those, 3 of them in the city, and because we are working on creating a regional conversation about racial equity. We also had one meeting in St. Charles County and one in St. Louis County. And we're looking to have one in St. Clair County as well. And so far we've had over 140 participants. We've been soliciting why haven't the calls to action from the Forward Through Ferguson report been implemented. So identifying those barriers to achieving those. And otherwise re-engaging the many people that are interested and want to see progress on these issues. So a preview of the timeline. As I said before, we're in the indicator research and development process, so I'll explain a little bit more about that. So I've been doing that since day one and expect to be doing that through the end of the year. I think it's a very important thing to take time to do, to re-engage with the stakeholders around the data, the people whose performance we want to measure, so that when we publish this dashboard, it has the buy-in of the right people. Looking ahead into next year, after the indicators have been selected and analyzed, we will be spending an appropriate amount of time developing a communication strategy around that, and the output of this project will be an online accountability dashboard that's accessible to the public. Our vision is to coordinate with Forward Through Ferguson on the launch date. They're planning to release their strategic plan for the future of Forward Through Ferguson on March 28th. So we would like to launch at least version 1.0 of our dashboard on that day, knowing that it'll be change over time and it'll evolve. So I wanted to give just a brief overview of kind of the decisions that have been made. So again, these equity indicators are being based on the priorities set out through the Forward Through Ferguson work. So that's justice for all, youth at the center, opportunity to thrive. And under each of those are sections where we're identifying indicators. How this project will work, how the City University of New York modeled it is each of these sections will we're measuring racial disparities on indicators, and those form into a score, and ultimately, the city of St. Louis is going to get an overall equity score, a single number. Just for a point of reference, New York's equality score is something around 48 points out of 100. So it's going to boil up to a number so we can, communicate on progress over time. So we're going to be measuring each of these indicators annually to see either progress or a lack of progress over time. Can you just go back for 1 second? I've highlighted, you can't really, I'll read them to you. I've highlighted the ones that are relevant to public safety. Of course, all of them are relevant to you because we're an Gordian knot, but the ones that are most directly relevant to the Public Safety Committee are police reform, court reform, and then health and safety. So on indicator selection, again, priorities were based on the Ford through Ferguson report. The initial list of these indicators were created in consultation with the CUNY experts. So they've gone through this process before, identified hundreds of indicators. So we started with that list, and then we're refining it, adding gaps. So how I'm proposing the criteria for selection is the data available. Is that data reliable? Is it collected annually or regularly? And then, very importantly, does it inform decision-making? I want us to be held accountable for initiatives, for investments. So if there is some investment tied to measuring progress and reducing racial disparities in that area, I want to include it. It's higher priority for me. As well, looking at revealing blind spots where we don't have stakeholders organized to address that racial disparity.
Would you explain CONY to us?
Which one?
City University of New York.
Yeah, City University of New York. So that's the partners that Rockefeller funded to provide technical support to the 5 cities that are in this cohort. So those are some of my criteria for selection. It's a evolving list, and the steps that I'm currently doing, I had a meeting this morning with our, health commissioner, where we're identifying indicator stakeholders. So as I said before, these are the stakeholders whose performance are being measured. So I've met with Metro Police, subject matter experts, so people who are working on reducing racial disparities in their work today, Generate Health with infant mortality and maternal health, and as well as department heads. So my goal is to meet with every department head and starting in January, meet with each one of you. So what we're doing in these meetings, I'm vetting these proposed indicators for data quality, for availability, and so some of these measures are more difficult to collect than others. So I'll go a little bit into that. But and then looking at addressing gaps. So what are the things we would like to measure that are important to measure around police reform or court reform, and identifying where we're unable to measure those because those measurements do not currently exist. So next slide. I just wanted to give you, I'm a diagram person, if you can't tell already, but I wanted to just give you a glance at how I'm thinking about identifying potential ways to measure racial inequity. So I'm looking at systems level reform and trying to understand the systems. So this represents a map of opportunities for racial inequity to occur in the justice system. And that helps brainstorm potential indicators. So, and one of those that is going to be in the dashboard for sure for court reform is pretrial detention population. So is there a racial disparity in who's being put in pretrial detention? Yep, so I don't want to go through that one, but that's just an overview of how I wanted to show you how I'm thinking. This one I'll spend a little more time on. This is just For each section, I'm identifying, one, the data stakeholders, so who owns the data, what are the indicators that we are looking at, and so here you can see I've met with Metro Police, had these indicators vetted, so to make sure that we have this data and that they're prepared to give it, to provide it. And then, so next Monday is our meeting with with personnel to go more, to understand whether we can have access to the police recruiting pipeline. So I want to understand if our goal is to have a more diversified police force that represents our community, understanding there's steps that go into that. So not just measuring the demographics of the police force, but understanding the demographics of police recruits, police academy enrollees, as well as police promotion rates. So understanding that whole pipeline, so we can identify red flags of what part of the process isn't working. So that is each of these indicators has multiple stakeholders. We also plan to pull in information from the courts and through the Regis Justice Data System to really get a picture of whether we're making progress on issues like police reform. So some of the things I wanted to bring to your attention, I invite you to tell me potential indicators, and I will be happy to research them and either tell you why or why not whether I can use that or not in this work. I'm also, where are there data gaps? So as the Public Safety Committee, you have been working on these issues for a while, so this is something I want to hear from you. And then from your perspective, what are the barriers to measuring performance against public safety priorities? So as far as legislative support, I wanted to preview for you that I am seeing data and technology issues. So, and that there'll be budget needs for better data and technology. And some of that will be coming, I'm sure, from when we hire a CTO and a CIO through that, but understanding that data and technology is kind of the basis for us to hold these, many of these agencies and institutions accountable. And without data, they can turn a blind eye to their performance in terms of racial inequity. So, and I also want to invite you to begin thinking about more ways, accountability mechanisms for this dashboard, for this equity indicators dashboard to have its full effect. There needs to be rewards for good performance and ways to hold poor performance accountable. So begin thinking about whether there needs to be legislation or legislative solutions to those issues. So. And for next steps, for us, it is continual collaboration with you, and also I wanted to invite you to, tell us how involved you would like to be, and next steps from your perspective as well.
In terms of if committee members or aldermen have thoughts and ideas about indicators, how do we communicate that to you? Do we just call you up? You want to come to another meeting? How do you want that done?
I'm happy to come to another meeting. I don't have a phone number at City Hall, so you can email me.
That's the first communications problem.
Data and technology issues. You can email me. My email is garmendiac at St. Louis MOU.
We can send all
We can send all that to you. Just send us a,
We're at your disposal.
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Whatever we need to do, we're happy to communicate at any point, whether that's come back to another meeting, host smaller group meetings, one-on-ones, whatever we need to do.
The project really, even when we look at how other cities are approaching this, the idea that it is the government choosing to measure this stuff and be transparent about it and measure progress over time. It's really kind of bringing a lot of things out of a black box, especially with the process mapping that goes into deciding what the indicators are. We have a lot of things that we might agree upon, but the path to get to how to change it is a black box, as well as understanding things that we're actually not measuring and that we don't have infrastructure to measure that are in the way of progress that we all greatly want to see. So I know it sounds like a lot of process and a lot more studying and a lot more numbers, but this approach really using the way government works and the way that accountability works within government infrastructure, it's really kind of bringing a lot of things out of a black box that'll enable all of us to hold ourselves more accountable.
Any questions, member of the committee? Alderman Boyd?
Christina, well, am I saying welcome to St. Louis or just welcome to City Hall?
Both. Well, welcome back to St. Louis.
Okay, and where did you come back from?
I was most recently the Senior Fellow for Metropolitan Equity at Rutgers Law in Newark, New Jersey.
Okay, so based on your experience, when we're looking at these indicators, can we drill down from a personnel standpoint to look at certain indicators where what a person's social economic status is, whether they have a certain type of degree, what environment they grew up in, to project potential problems? And here's the scenario, like with police department, for example, because that's a real tough issue that we need to deal with to kind of bring that trust back. So you look at these indicators and determine what type of training that we need to provide. Is that all part of this system of what we're dealing with?
I think that's a little bit outside the scope.
Okay.
We're going to be providing accountability on certain measures. It won't be sufficient. It'll tell us where there are problems, but not how to solve those problems necessarily. So I am going to be looking at ways to really refine, to help us identify exactly where the problem is. So taking that police demographic, the pipeline there. So where's the missing link? Are we bringing in diverse recruits? Are they succeeding in the academy? Where's the issue? So being able to more refine, target where the issues are, that is one of my goals. But as far as a dashboard would not tell you the solutions.
Right, no, I understand that.
Yeah.
I would offer, though, that what measuring it does and putting everybody on the same page about where the levers are and what the measures are, it gives it fertilizes a soil for better problem solving.
Yeah.
So what we have a lot of now, especially in the justice pipeline, is you have different pieces of the responsibility held in different branches of government or different agencies that don't necessarily have to collaborate. And because there's a lack of data, the problem solving slows down, because somebody can just say, well, that's really in their court, or that's really in their court, or that's really their decision. But once you start to measure those outcomes over time and really look at the outcomes that are coming out of each part of the pipeline, it becomes harder to be confused about who needs to be at the table to solve the problem.
So who's going to synthesize all that so that we create a better government structure and the flow of communications and data and all of that stuff flows freely where we can make better decisions?
That is why we're the only city, I believe, who hired a project manager for this project, and that is why we did that, so that we had somebody whose job it was to think not only about what indicators we use and how we display them, but how we're going to operationalize them. So through the process of doing this and making the process maps like she's doing and having the stakeholder conversations that she's having, I see as one of the outcomes to have that synthesized more clearly around each issue. And we also invested in some communication strategy to go with this, to communicate to us, okay, here's what the dashboard says about this area, and here's what a path might look like to solve it. Here's who the stakeholders are that need to be involved in that. Here's a process they might use. So we wanted to really make sure that we're addressing that, but it is an ongoing part of the process, but it is a desired outcome.
Okay, thank you.
So just to build on that, if I could, this is as much a data tool as it is a performance management tool. And that's really phase 2 of a ongoing multiple phase sort of project, because I think we're recognizing, and we spoke to the mayor about this yesterday, this is really a Pandora's box of opportunity for us, something that we've never really done in city government before, and go through a methodical process mapping of how things happen and where the bottlenecks are. When we identify those bottlenecks, that gives us an opportunity, not necessarily what will be displayed on the indicator dashboard, but it gives us and you all an opportunity to hone in on those specific bottlenecks and propose potential solutions. And
So let me ask you this, Patrick, then. So this new structure we're putting in place, your position, Nicole's position, Christine's position, is this sustainable? Is this going to just be something trendy and new that we'll see for this first few years because some of the funding is by grant? Or is this something that the city of St. Louis is going to say, hey, look, we're going to own this, we're committed to this, and 10 years from now, we'll still be tracking data?
yeah.
That's part of why we're here today, because we know we need to engage with the legislative branch to fertilize the soil for that to happen. It is also on our radar as one of the key priorities for this time. So Christina's position is funded through the end of this year. My position will exist, depending on what a next administration or how long the current administration is in play. And I think Patrick's position is funded through September of next year. So one of our key priorities is how are we going to maintain this? I will say that Mayor Cruson is hyperly focused on the idea of data and insight and action around that data. That's the bonus of having a CPA for a mayor. And we have already been looking at other departments separate from equity, how performance and process and outcomes are measured. And so there are a couple of different efforts happening where what other cities have done is they have a equity performance manager position that's embedded into all of the department's work. So those are the types of outcomes we are seeking to have in the future so that we can find existing positions that we can slide and expand the responsibilities to keep this moving. But I think we'll all have to think together about how we make sure that this is something that is still happening in 10 years. That's kind of one of my mottos of my position. If I'm working on something that only happens if I'm here, I'm not spending my time well on behalf of the citizens. So that is a number one goal, to understand how we most securely embed this work in the interworkings of our shared government.
So I would like to encourage you guys as you're moving through to communicate with the chairman of different committees that impact the work that you're doing, because I know as chairman of Streets, Refuse, and Lighting, I'm very interested in how we can deliver more efficient quality services to our constituents. And some of it is a crossover. There's some things that forestry does versus refuse, and how can both of them do it better together, right? Absolutely. Okay, thank you.
Yes, please.
Alderman Vaccaro, you said you didn't have any questions. Alderman Cone.
I don't have any questions at this time. I would just like to reiterate what Alderman Boyd said, that as you're going through this process, just ensure that, obviously this committee, because there is a lot in terms of public safety that you all have been discussing throughout this presentation, but there are, other chairmen, chairwomen that you'll probably be touching on their territories, if you will, as you're going through this process. And just making sure that they're in the loop in terms of, anything that you're, needing, or, obviously, I think just as a general courtesy, even if you're not asking them for anything, it would be nice to make sure that they're in the loop if you're planning on touching anything that's within their purview.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, we're just considering perhaps a meeting with all the chairs. We'll talk to you. We know you're a chair now, so we'll include you in on that.
The fast rise, yes.
Alderwoman Spencer?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for being here. This is exciting to see progress and see where we're going with this. One of the questions I have, the first thing that came into my mind is, what are other cities doing? I think we often try to reinvent the wheel without doing it as successfully as other cities. I'm particularly interested in what cities are spending to address issues, and what other cities have forged in as far as relationships with outside agencies, partnerships, looking at some of our most significant public safety issues, obviously our homicide rate, our drug overdose, our STD levels, these are off the charts. We are number one or very close to number one in the nation in all these areas. And we spend very little on the preventative side on all of these issues. And where do we rank on that nationwide? I know that the city is, our budget, we have budget constraints obviously in tackling some of these issues, but we can partner with outside nonprofit agencies and other things to kind of start to try to address this. So if you don't mind speaking on the work we're going to be doing, looking at what other cities are, just briefly, you don't have to feel like you have to go into depth, but certainly that's part of what we're doing here.
Sure. So with the Resilient Cities Network, there are the 25 other American cities as well as the global network and the capacity from the different consulting teams that work with Patrick. In terms of equity, the work that Ford through Ferguson is doing, they're working with a national organization called Policy Link that looks at how they take advocacy, community-focused advocacy to policy. And so working closely with them, we will also be learning from the national models. The group that does the 2.5-day workshop that we'll bring in, they are also work nationally on these issues. What I'll say is that we have heard from a number of national partners how unique we are here. Not just in where we rank, but in how we approach and how we're structured. There's one in particular that has been working in St. Louis now for 3 or 4 years, and when they first came here, people were like, it's kind of different here. And they were like, nah, I've worked on this all over the country, it's the same everywhere. And after about 4 years, they were like, wow, it's really different here. So while we have been and do have access to lots of sort of national best practices, and I also will add that just being at a national conference through the Mental Health Board last week, other cities are grappling with the language and the structure to address this stuff internally and build this infrastructure. People are some of them are getting at it through trauma-informed language, some of them are saying race, some of them are saying equity, some of them are saying equality. So it's kind of a burgeoning field for people to really build the governmental infrastructure for this. There are a few cities like Seattle and a couple others who have positions and who are starting to do it. I think looking at how much people are spending is something that we haven't done, which I'd be actually interested to know that number as well. And the different approaches from partnering with outside agencies to literally hiring staff whose job it is to move the stuff forward are kind of all over the map as well. So that's kind of a hodgepodge of touching on all of those things, but I think I answered your question.
Yeah, and I think looking at not only what people are spending, but what the governments are spending. So, for example, our city, what is our city spending to prevent the STDs? And not just our city, but our state, the state of Missouri is notoriously low on spending on health and human services and issues that pertain to urban environments and urban challenges. And, I think we should also look at our state policies as it pertains to school funding, health funding, things like Medicaid and the lack of expansion there, drug treatment and other things that our state, we can start to kind of identify as issues, the criminal justice system certainly and all those other things. So hopefully looking outside of just the city, obviously our national political environment is sort of insane, for lack of a better word, right now, or in flux, but we can kind of look at some of those other things. I'd also hopefully kind of look at how we internally pay for things, how we tax our residents, how the city is obtaining the money that we have to keep going. We're one of the highest sales tax cities in the country right now, and I think that's an issue of racial equity, considering that sales tax is certainly regressive, and so hopefully we can include some of that, how we not only collect money from fees and property tax and things like that, but looking not only nationally, but regionally, how the city differs from the counties and surrounding areas on some of these spending measures and taxing measures.
Christina touched on it, but we are partnering with the United Way to help this be a regional effort, knowing that we have the funding and we have municipal buy-in. We'll see how the other municipalities surrounding us come along, but that's part of why we wanted to make sure we have a regional picture, because our 62 square miles are, not where it starts and ends. As well, the dream version of this, with maybe a couple more staff people, would launch with budget tied to these indicators, because we recognize that unless we are also looking at what we are and aren't investing in, or how our investments are or are not paying off, as well as the multitude of different funding streams that go into or past some of these issues, that we're not showing the full picture. So I'm not sure that we will launch with that level of detail with the budget, but
I
it's,
certainly see that as the
Yeah.
next step, especially on the performance management, things that you do is looking at resource allocation. So I am, as I'm meeting with department heads and other stakeholders, asking them what initiatives or projects are happening around addressing these racial disparities. So I am trying to create a catalog of those so we know kind of what to keep track of.
Thank you so much. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Kind of to that point, because we jumped into the equity indicator project without really explaining its origin, aside from it relating to 100 Resilient Cities. And so to the Alderman's point about looking at what other cities are doing, we're one of 5 cities doing this equity project right now, funded again by the Rockefeller Foundation. All the other cities are participants in the 100 Resilient Cities program, and that is Dallas, Tulsa, Oakland, and Pittsburgh. 30 or so, 26 to 30 cities applied. We were selected to be one of the 5. And so there is Christina's on a weekly call, we're on 2 weekly calls with the CUNY Foundation, and one of those calls is with the other cities. And so we're kind of sharing best practices and talking about how the other cities are going through this process. New York actually did this already in 2015. And so they have and so we're building upon the idea of how they did this to some degree. And so year after year, our job is to report back on progress. And so New York has actually done their progress report, and so we'll be, again, building off that sort of model. Just wanted to mention that.
Alderwoman Boyd, any questions?
Yes, I do. My first question, I heard you all, and I think when we had met before in regards to you doing the training, and I had asked you, had you worked with the employees? And you said, no, not at the time, you hadn't worked with them. And so I'm looking at, when are you going to work? Because I guess I'm looking at, from a manager's perspective, I can get all the training in the world, but if my staff doesn't buy into it or understand why and how things are done, we're throwing stones at somebody else's house and ours is not in order.
Agreed. So we, just last week, got the go-ahead. We're going to have 6 2.5-day intensive trainings in first quarter of next year, and we'll have 240 seats for those. Okay. The mayor's going to be asking her cabinet and key leadership to go through that workshop. We'll also open that invite up to the Board of Aldermen, other elected officials, because we'll have plenty of seats. And so that training is really looking at, it's a workshop, I'd call it, more so than a training. It's a little bit of both. It's focused on the institutional participation and interaction with systemic racism, and understanding that, mostly about how it works at an institutional level, a little bit of individual level, but mostly around the institutional interventions. And the one whole day is looking at your sort of department or your company, and what you do and can change around interrupting institutional racism. So that training will happen first quarter of next year, and we'll be in the process of designing what the next step is for the remainder of department. That's a pretty high-level intensive training. We'll probably develop some more entry-level stuff, some ongoing things, some opportunities for facilitated conversations. We might train some folks internally to facilitate, but we'll be working with our department heads to design what that next step looks like. We'll probably bring the Government Alliance for Race and Equity back back in. They were here last year. So we are planning to, and that was a big thing that was talked about at this national conference last week, was that realizing that internally inside government, there are issues that we have to deal with. And we can't turn around and better serve our constituents if we haven't dealt with that first. So that is exactly the approach that we are taking, and that will roll out in the first quarter of next year.
So because I know some departments are very large.
Yep.
So if you're training the managers, now are they required to go train their staff?
It won't be a train the trainer from the beginning. Because it's such a intense training. I think they apprentice people for like a year before somebody becomes a trainer for this stuff. But we will be looking at from department to department what the best approach is. The way we have resourced it, we've resourced the opportunity to do this training from outside mostly, so we haven't asked anybody to take out of their budget. Looking forward, that's why we want to kind of take a look at what is the infrastructure, how do we roll this out in different departments, and that'll probably have to be done because of the size differential department by department, and then take a look at how we might fund that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
You have something? I believe that completes our questioning. We appreciate you being here. We're going to work out some other things for you to come forward to.
Great.
And I'm sure there'll be other updates as you go along.
Yes,
so
we're happy
look
to
forward
do
Yeah,
that
tell
as
us a
well.
bunch of stuff out, because you told us 10 minutes.
You took way more than 10 minutes.
Okay.
Thank
All right,
you.
then. Then that completes our agenda today. We appreciate you all coming out. And with that, our meeting's adjourned.